My guest today is John Cochrane, Professor of Economics at Stanford University and Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute. John spent most of his career at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on the dynamics of stock and bond markets, as well as on the relationship between deficits and inflation.
Hey, John, it's really great to have you. Thanks for coming to this conversation. It's really kind. Thanks.
It's great to be here. Great to do this. Thank you.
All right. So where are we? Just to start with the current moment, where are we in the pandemic? As we get this reopening back, we need to start moving people back to work. In the U.S., the U.S. and Europe had a very, very different reactions in terms of policy. How do you see these two reactions differently, and how are they going to? How would you get people back to work right now after this period?
Yeah, I'm actually not sure the policies were that different. The policies were on the worker side. Europe said we'll pay companies to keep workers on the payroll. On the American side, by and large, we have a paycheck protection program, which was aimed at the same thing. But at the same time, we also used the unemployment insurance system, vastly expanded to pay people who came home, which is, you don't want to have a wave of mortgage foreclosures and evictions and a wave of bankruptcies in a 2-month recession. So that was, at least that's what was done in both cases. I don't think it's that different. The question for us all is not how to get out of it. A lot of those policies were predicated, I think, on a V-shaped 3-month pause, the long vacation. It's not going to be a long vacation. So lending money to companies leads to the question of how long do they want to borrow money just to do nothing, and as opposed to go bankrupt? When does that all fall apart? And when are they going to ever pay it back, or are they going to pay it back? And on the worker side, at some point, you have to move from insurance to incentives. Rather than pay people to do nothing, people need a little bit of an incentive to get back to work at their old jobs or to go find new jobs. There's been big reallocations. There are lots of new jobs in America. Amazon is trying hard to hire people and can't find employees. Some businesses even want to bring their employees back, and the employees are saying, well, I'm making more on unemployment insurance than I was ever making with you, so I'm staying home and watching Netflix.
What are you've suggested some policy ideas in your job. Can you tell us some of those?
Oh, well, when you're designing an unemployment system, you have to balance the insurance with the incentives. So at some point, you need to make more money going back to work than you do staying home. And you want to balance that with, on the other hand, you don't want to cause great economic pain of people who are unemployed. So, can you do a system where rather than go back to work and you lose your unemployment, maybe you can keep the unemployment for a month when you go back to work, and then you get the incentive and the insurance as well. Yes, that's expensive, but we're spending $5 trillion, so we could afford a lot. And back to the test, we're spending $5 trillion. So, and then we're being cheap about 20 million on who pays for the tests. I mean, come on. The US also, by the way, so flexibility in labor markets is a big issue, I know, in Europe, and it's increasingly an issue in the US. When you're in a time of great turmoil, as we are, you want flexible labor markets. You want people, if you can, if your job at the factory ended and you can work delivering food for people, which is a big thing going on. It's very hard to get food deliveries going on. So you want an economy where people can run back and forth like that. Now, our regulatory state has been trying to stop the gig economy, but of course the gig economy is a great way for people to temporarily make some money while they're waiting for their company to be unshut down. So all these labor market, we've all said, sort of like St. Augustine, dear Lord, give me structural reform, but not quite yet. The structural reform policies would help all of us because there's big changes in the economy. It's not just the economy comes back on. It's different things. I think a lot of business is going to move out of cities. Restaurants, bars, and airlines may never, not for years, come back, but other things move in. Food delivery is a big one. Contact tracers, we need a lot of them. People taking your temperature outside of the grocery store, we need a lot of those. Well, people have to move from one job to another, and that takes a flexible labor market, not the sort of lifetime employment with a gold watch that Europe is certainly famous for.
Mm-hmm. You taught me my first graduate class of macroeconomics, which was, I would say, not Keynesian, which was a very much a real business cycle based class. And now we're talking about employment benefits and bailouts and liquidity for firms. We'll talk about all that. Are we now, as Bob Lucas once said in 2008, are we all Keynesians in the foxhole? Is this a moment where people like you or like other people who basically been working on a view of the economy, which is basically self-equilibrating, etc., think, oh well, maybe we change our minds? Or how do you read what's happening in that sense, intellectually?
There certainly is, all of public policy balances this problem of help versus incentives, which is just the hard, if you want to do cause and effect effective public policy, you have to recognize that the more help you get, the more incentive problems you have. It's especially, it's not so much, Keynes didn't talk about bailouts, but our financial system is bailout central now. And Bob may be right in that any of us put in the, you or me put in the Federal Reserve Chairman's seat, and a crisis is coming, we're going to throw money at it and worry about the moral hazard later. Well, but nobody's ever worrying about the moral hazard. Yeah. Those incentive problems are still there. They are not going away. And even as the economic recovery, what we were talking about with labor, a true Keynesian would say, there is no problem ever of supply, it's just demand. Give people enough money and supply will take care of itself. Well, we've been talking about supply, incentives, giving people the incentive to go back to work. Giving people money is not going to make airlines come back if the airlines are shut down by government decree. And it's not going to bring restaurants back if restaurants have to charge 3 times as much because people have to be spaced 3 times as far from each other. So we have a supply problem. We have a looming finance problem. If the recession keeps going and companies run out of money, which is a much more sophisticated question than just borrow money and throw it out and hope the demand for consumption brings about its magical supply. So you haven't made me admit to Keynesianism yet.
You're making a difference between an insurance function in some sense and this idea of aggregate demand management, which I think is a basic distinction that allows for this. Is that the right distinction to think about?
That's a very important point. Right. There's an insurance function of help keep people from going bankrupt in a 3-month pandemic. Then there's the view that the way to get GDP going again is simply aggregate demand. Either borrow or print money and give it to people, and that's all the government needs to do to worry about the economy. So a real Keynesianism says that the key to getting the economy going is just to borrow money or print it and give it to people, and then their spending will get the economy going. And you don't have to worry about what's going on in the factories and labor markets and so forth. Where what we've just been talking about is the inefficiency of running a factory under social distancing, the need to get workers to go to new jobs, the need to get new companies started, new entrepreneurial, they need to have greater competition between companies to force them to efficiencies. They're non-Keynesian supply things. And I'm quite sad, actually. The Keynesians won the marketing. The US bills are called stimulus bills. Well, that's not the point. The point is hopefully to keep the economy cratering through letting people not go bankrupt, but not this idea that just we need to give people money and the whole supply into the economy will take care of itself, because that's certainly not the case. And we need to do a lot of getting out of the way on the supply end.
Plus, as Margaret Thatcher liked to say, I guess, you eventually run out of other people's money. Unless you believe in MMT. Why don't you just mention it before? Why don't we do this chance? to talk about it. There's a view now among some, I wouldn't call it very mainstream economists, that you basically have no constraints because you can always print more money. I don't know if you can just basically give a, we don't need to spend a ton of time on it, but
No, we need to talk about this. I'll pitch that I wrote a review of Stephanie Kelton's MMT book in the Wall Street Journal. So there's 1,600 carefully chosen words on what I think of MMT. It does combine some interesting ideas and then just logically goes wrong. But MMT is only the extreme end of much more respectable ideas taking over throughout, and certainly the actions of politicians, that we can print as much money as we want, we can borrow as much money as we want, throw it down rat holes if we feel like it, and never have to worry about paying it back. And in one way or another, those ideas are out there. The more respectable ones, we've Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard, very prominent economists, have come out for the ability to borrow lots and lots of money and not have to worry about paying it back. They are a little bit aghast about being passed on the left by the Keltons and company, who say borrow even more money and not worry about paying it back. As long as interest rates stay very low, that's, there's some point to it. Our politicians are certainly not worrying about paying it back. And that's in fact one of the saddest parts. All the economists, Larry and Olivier, who are great, thoughtful economists, paint a picture of you can borrow money and spend it very wisely on needed infrastructure. Our politicians, when they get the idea you don't have to pay the money back, don't add that test. They are happy to just throw the money at whatever rat hole their constituents want the money at. So the feeling that we don't have to pay it back is, I think, widespread, both in academia and in public policy. I still think that money will have to be paid back sooner or later, easier or harder. And our government should be paying a little more attention to just how much debt they're racking up. Yes.
So that's the crux of the problem facing the world economy in the near future. Let me say, to be fair, that Olivier Blanchard was in the show, and he did say there was a possibility that we print too much money, that the inflation can come back. He talked about three conditions. First, a very large increase in the debt to GDP ratio, which I guess a condition that we would all agree is going to be fulfilled. Second, a very large increase in neutral rate of interest, and the same real rate needed to keep the economy at potential. And third, and perhaps most importantly, fiscal dominance of monetary policy, meaning the central banks are submitted to the designs of politicians who need interest rates to be low. So I wanted to ask you probably to reflect on these conditions, but more broadly, to think about how does this end? In your view, not in the views of others now, what is the limit? At what point we have just borrowed so much and we have injected so much and that we have either inflation or default? How does this end? And if you can comment also on those, are those the conditions?
Okay, well, you're going to get a lecture on the fiscal theory of the price level here.
Well, you are the experts. So,
okay. First, debt to GDP ratios are not a good guide. We had inflation broke out in the 1970s despite quite low debt to GDP ratios. What was lost was the faith that the debt that was left would be paid back. At the end of World War II, we had quite high debt to GDP ratios, but we had a good plan for paying it off. And as a result, there was not much inflation right after World War II. So it's about the debt versus the capacity to pay it off, like any borrower. So there isn't a magic number, 92% past which inflation comes. It's is there faith among investors that you have a plan for paying off that debt? And a good plan would be the post-World War II plan. Strong supply side growth. Then the tax base grows, tax revenues grow, plus fiscal prudence. We ran fiscal surpluses, primary surpluses, from 1947 to about 72. So fiscal probity and strong growth is a plan that convinces investors you're going to pay it back and you don't get inflation. Well, we got neither of those right now. The interest rate that counts here, so it is true if you, right now, governments can borrow at about 1%. So wow, the costs of borrowing are not particularly high. those rates could go up. And I think the thing to fear is that the rates that markets charge governments go up. There's a doom loop here that our Greek friends know something about, that you can afford your debts at a low interest rate. You can't afford them at a high interest rate. And if markets charge a higher default or risk premium to sovereign debts, then you can get quickly stuck in a crisis. I think that is the danger we face, is not one of an easily foreseeable, there's the edge of the cliff, debt to GDP ratio of 92.3%. Oops, we're up to 87.9, better scale back. It is more, what's the probability of an earthquake? What's the probability of a Greek-style crisis coming to hit all of us? I hope that's a ways away, but it's unpredictable when it comes. It will, of course, come along with some horrendously bad news. So if we're in an expansion recovering, our fiscal states are recovering, I think it's less likely, but it's likely to break out when the next piece of really bad news breaks out, and then investors say, we just don't want any of this.
So the idea is that we need a situation that, I was going to ask you, how is that credibility lost? How is that moment where people look at the same number they used to be looking at, and they're like, yeah, they'll pay back. And at some point they look at it and they say, I think these governments are never going to pay this back. How does this change in expectations and in confidence happen? And you're saying you need some extra piece of bad news?
So remember, our governments are doing what our financial institutions do. We are rolling over very short-term debt. If our governments borrowed long-term, or even the way Queen Victoria used to borrow, perpetual bonds, then you've locked in the financing, much as a house that takes out a 30-year mortgage locks in the financing. We are all rolling over very short-term debt. So if interest rates go up, that's a fiscal problem right away. And an investor in short-term debt is not thinking about, is the US government going to run out its medical and social and pension promises that it's made 20 years from now, can it pay those back? That's the issue in the US, that we've made long-term promises that we can't pay for. The one-year bondholder is thinking, well, is there going to be somebody next year who will lend them the money to pay me back? And that's the faith that gets lost. So you can see the instability of it. It's like a run. I get out before everybody else gets out. And similarly, if I'm holding government debt and inflation starts coming, then I want to get out fast and put my money in real assets before the other people do. And then everybody else gets out, and then the interest rates you need to keep people in go up, and then it's fiscally unsustainable. Now, as I think Greece is a good example, because there was an accounting scandal, there was an event, and you need an event. So my fear of this comes, the scenario would be we rack up 200% of debt to GDP ratios. We don't really reform our economies. We grow slowly. And then the next, pandemic, war, recession, financial crisis hits. Our governments then want to roll over 200% of debt to GDP. They want to borrow additional 5-10 trillion euros to bail out everybody right, left, and center. Our private economies are stoked full of debt. In the US, there's a movement to cancel student loans. Our state and local governments have borrowed an immense amount of money, and the cities are now a disaster financially. So they may all go under. Our pensions have made promises they can't keep. All of that then ends up being bailed out by the federal government, along with unreformed entitlements, slow growth, a war, a recession, political chaos. And when does the moment that the bondholders say, yes, but this will all pass, and they will start running fiscal surpluses and return to growth and pay us back? Somewhere in that chaotic moment, the bondholders say, no, I want gold stocks, real estate, Swiss francs, something like that, and then the problems happen.
You have said in the past, you've written in the past, the problem most likely doesn't come in the form of a default, but comes in the form of inflation. You said the way governments default is not really, governments like the US, is not really by just saying we won't pay, right? How would that problem actually manifest itself?
Well, governments have, in a debt crisis, you have a choice. Large governments, and Europe as a whole and the US have the choice of, do we just print up money to pay off debts, or do we officially default on them? And they'll probably just print up non-interest bearing money to pay off debts and let it happen through inflation rather than explicit default. Greece didn't have that option because it was a member of the euro, which is why it played out that way. But we don't have a Germany to come pay the bills. So if that happens to Europe as a whole or to the US, it will likely end up as a sharp inflation. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. So for those who have been left over until now, do you dare to explain a little bit, I guess your first couple of chapters of the book, to explain basically what do the basic theories of money out there say, and what does your theory say, and how are the fiscal theories say of prices, and why inflation happens, what is the basic mechanism behind inflationary process, and explain a little bit why you think that those theories don't actually work, and we need something that actually works also for electronic money, etc.
Well, thank you. So we are at a crux in monetary theory that the standard theories really are wrong, let's face it. And they failed miserably faced with at the zero bound episode. The standard Keynesian theories said we're going to have a deflation spiral. The monetarists said here comes Zimbabwe, and they were just both absolutely wrong. When you look at our modern financial system, what we have is, by and large, interest-paying electronic money that is the same as debt. So the distinction between money and bonds just doesn't, there is no distinction anymore. Where you can think of it as we live on a barter economy where we can wire bonds around. So they've kind of fallen apart theoretically. The fiscal theory is extremely simple. There's this long-standing puzzle in economics. Why do we work so hard for these pieces of paper? They're pieces of paper. They're worth nothing. They're not even pretty like the paintings behind me here. By and large, maybe they have pictures of interesting old people on them. Why do we work so hard for these pieces of paper? Well, the fiscal theory answers this classic question by saying we work so hard for them because the government requires you to pay taxes with these pieces of paper. So they gain some value in the US every April 15th. And that means April 14th, you're willing to work hard to get the pieces of paper you need to give to the government. So in the end, money is valued because you need to pay for taxes. You need to pay taxes with it. That's an insight that goes back to Adam Smith. Now that seems obvious, but think about all the things.
I was impressed you found the required Adam Smith quote.
I didn't. Ross Starr from UC San Diego found it about 30 years ago, and I appreciate him finding that quote from Adam Smith. Now, what you'd be surprised is that the standard, your listeners may be surprised, standard monetary theory ignores this fact. And either money is just an intrinsically worthless thing that we've all decided to use, that's fiat money, or the mechanics of the IS and LM diagrams somehow mysteriously bring about a value for money, which I won't bother with a critique of now. So this is just a very simple kind of obvious theory, and the work is in bringing that to the data, putting it in modern economic models, making it usable for our friends who do simulation models for central banks, answering all the queries and quibbles. But how could something so simple and obvious not be true? That in the end, what stops inflation is our government's willingness to soak up extra money with taxes minus spending. That's it. And even the modern monetary theorists got that one right. So it's
What soaks up money at this particular moment, John, when we see a tsunami of liquidity going to every financial market by central banks, is the expectation that in this theory, is the expectation that everybody has that somehow at the end of the day, debts will be repaid. This is the basic mechanics.
That's the basic mechanics. And if people start worrying that debt will not be repaid, then they try to get rid of that debt and they try to buy other stuff and they drive up the prices of the other stuff. It's good old classic aggregate demand, but it says that all government debts are the same, that what central banks do is they sort of take away your green debt and give you yellow debt instead. They take away your overnight interest-bearing reserves and give you 1 month treasury debt instead. So a fiscal theorist would say, look, to first order, that doesn't matter. It's the overall quantity of debt relative to the government's ability to repay in our economies now, the way things work now. And which means that central banks our central banks were unable to get inflation going when they wanted to. Well, we kind of got lucky there, but that means the central banks will be hard pressed to stop inflation when it comes if this mechanism is that people want less of all government debt. And when people want less government debt, what can the government do? Well, if it has the ability to raise taxes or cut spending to soak up the extra debts that people don't want, then you don't get inflation. But if the government has lost the ability or the will to do that, then you get inexorably inflation. That's it. Real simple.
Very good. Well, thanks a lot, John. It was really a pleasure. I think we covered a lot. I hope people could also keep up with the last bits, a bit more technical, but I think it was really a pleasure to have
Thank you. And good luck to you and your colleagues, and to I'm one of the few Americans who's a great fan of the European project. I hope you can keep it together, fix it, get it operational, and
I'm glad to hear that.
Strong economic growth and happiness.
Very good. Thank you very much.